Have you ever noticed how some societies talk about diversity as their greatest strength, while for others it's this really complex puzzle, loaded with historical baggage? Well, today, we're diving into a source that tries to get to the bottom of that exact question. We're going to explore the super tricky relationship between ethnic diversity, social cohesion, and the modern state. The whole thing really kicks off right here, with these two totally different ways of looking at the world. In the West, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries, you hear it all the time. Diversity is our strength. It's almost a given. But the source points out that if you're visiting from a more homogeneous city, like Warsaw or Prague, that can be kind of baffling. Their own history has often shown a much more complicated side to ethnic diversity. So here's how we're going to unpack this. First, we'll dig into that initial puzzle. Then, we're going to redefine what we even mean by diversity, because that's super important here. After that, we'll look at the real cost of deep divisions, try to understand why they form in the first place, and then wrap up by asking if this whole thing presents us with a trade-off we just can't avoid. All right, let's jump in with that first piece of the puzzle. Why the praise for diversity can seem so, puzzling. The source really starts by zooming in on this fundamental disconnect in how different cultures see this whole idea. The source gets right to the heart of it. It suggests that, yeah, there might be economic benefits in diverse cities like London or New York, but for an outsider, those positives can be totally overshadowed by negatives you can see right away. We're talking about things like higher crime, or just that feeling of alienation between people, and maybe a lower quality of public goods, things like clean streets or public transport, at least compared to what they're used to back home. Okay, so to really get the source's argument, we have to stop and redefine our terms. The text is super clear that not all diversity is created equal, and these distinctions are absolutely critical to understanding its main point. First up, we have what the source calls London-style diversity. This is basically the kind you see that comes from more recent waves of immigration, creating this big multicultural mix from new arrivals. And that's a brilliant contrast to Belfast-style diversity. Now, this is about divisions between groups that have lived in the same place for a very long time and often have a history of conflict, like the deep religious divides in Northern Ireland. As the source points out, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone promoting Belfast as a great place to live because of its diversity. Now, pay attention, because this is a huge point. Those economic upsides we often associate with diversity, like innovation and growth, the source argues they're actually linked to place diversity. That means having a lot of first-generation immigrants bringing new ideas and experiences. It's not the same thing as long-term, multi-generational ethnic diversity. And this leads us to the absolute core concept for the rest of this explainer, the ethnically divided society. This isn't just about different folks living in the same country. It's about a society where the boundaries between those groups are, as the source calls them, thick, and they profoundly shape how people live their lives. So what does that actually look like? Well, the source breaks it down into 4 key things. First, you've got clear markers like race or religion that define who's in what group. Second, your social life, your friends, your community, it mostly happens inside your group. Third, there aren't many connections between the groups. You can see this in things like segregated neighborhoods or low rates of intermarriage. And finally, and this is crucial, these divisions don't just fade away. They stick around, generation after generation. Now that we know what we're talking about, the source gets into the costs. So what's the big deal? What actually happens in these ethnically divided societies? What are the real-world consequences? And the source really doesn't pull any punches here. It makes a pretty blunt argument. If you hold all other factors constant, life in an ethnically divided society just tends to be worse than in one that's ethnically homogeneous. So let's break down the specific costs it's talking about. One of the biggest costs it highlights is all about money. In societies with these deep ethnic fault lines, you consistently see lower public support for welfare and for redistributing wealth. It seems people are just less willing to chip into a common pot when they feel less of a connection to the other people who'll be taking from it. And the list doesn't stop there. The source also connects these divisions to lower social capital. That's stuff like less trust and fewer connections between neighbors. It also points to a lower quality of public goods, higher support for political extremism, and, chillingly, a higher risk of violence between groups. This all naturally leads to the next big question. Why? Why do these divisions form, and why are they so sticky? The source suggests the answer is way more complicated than just saying racism, and it points to some much deeper, hardwired human behaviors. The source argues that a main driver here isn't necessarily hate or overt racism, but a far more basic human tendency called homophily, or what you could call in-group preference. It's that simple, often unconscious instinct to hang out with people who are like us. And to show just how deep this might run, the source even points to our own biology. Get this, the hormone oxytocin, you might know it as the love hormone, it also plays a huge role in social bonding. And it seems to actually wire us to cooperate with and show preferential treatment to members of our own group. And check this out, this is fascinating. Researchers ran computer simulations to see which survival strategy would win out over many generations. They tested 4 types: the humanitarian, who helps everyone; the traitor, who helps strangers but not their own kind; the selfish one, who takes advantage of everybody; and the ethnocentric strategy, cooperate with your own group but not with strangers. Guess which one was most likely to survive and thrive? Yep, in most of the simulations, it was the ethnocentric strategy. So with all that in our back pocket, the source builds to its final and maybe most challenging point, this idea of an unavoidable trade-off. This is where all the pieces we've been looking at come together. The key idea here is something called boundary thickness. When the cultural gap between groups is small, the source uses the example of Ukrainians and Poles who are culturally quite close, the boundaries are thin, and the negative effects of diversity are pretty minimal. But when groups are culturally very far apart, and the example the source gives is Muslims and non-Muslims in Europe, the boundaries are thick, and those negative consequences become much, much stronger. And this all leads to what the source frames as a fundamental problem, and it's summed up perfectly in this really powerful quote. Equality cannot be achieved without social solidarity. Social solidarity hardly exists without social cohesion, and social cohesion itself is undermined by ethnic diversity. So here's the bottom line. The source concludes that the social solidarity that holds up the modern welfare state is under some serious pressure. It argues that these systems were mostly built during times of high ethnic homogeneity, and that rising diversity, especially, the source specifies, from culturally distant groups, poses a fundamental challenge to that original foundation. And that leaves us with this final, really challenging question that comes directly out of the material we've just gone through. If the source is right, and solidarity really does depend on cohesion, and certain kinds of diversity challenge that cohesion, what does that actually mean for the future of the welfare state as we know it?